it's already made that there was a report which was released few weeks back, in fact a week back. UNFCCC, UN released a report adding up all the INDCs. Okay, but before I go that, I have shown you these two graphs. I just want to tell you what is the budget left. How much is it that the world can emit from now? In fact, the budget is from 2012 to 2100. If we really want to remain within 2 degrees. And I and Yuva were talking, and we said it is important for all of you to understand that the 2 degrees is not a scientific number. It is a political decision. Because at 2 degrees, as I showed you in the past presentation, number of threatened communities, vulnerable ecosystem will get destroyed. But the 2 degree is a political agreement between countries saying that we will restrict it to 2 degrees. So we have a budget for 2 degrees, which varies between 1000 billion tons of carbon dioxide to 1400 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So suppose if you want to have a probability of remaining within 33%, that the world temperature will remain within 33%, the world
temperature
can remain within 2 degrees, and the probability is 33% of remaining within 2 degrees, you can emit 1400 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Currently, the world emits about 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. Every year we emit 50 billion tons. At the extreme end, we have a budget of 1400 billion tons.
Which is left over.
Which is for 28 years. If the world continues emission as it is at 50 billion tons, we have a budget for 28 years. Okay? At the bottom end, we actually have a budget for 20 years. And out of those 20 years, 4 years are gone. Because we are in 2015, end of 2015 now. Okay? So I'm just giving you an idea about the carbon cake. The cake that I talked about, we talked about. We have a cake at the current emissions for next 28 years, which means it should finish anywhere by 2040, 42, at the bottom end at about 2035. The world has to, if we want to remain at less than 2 degrees, we should become net zero emitter by 2035, world as a whole. So I'm just giving you the size of the cake. Now, considering the size of the cake, let me go quickly to, do INDCs add up? Okay, now we have INDCs till 2030, which is just the beginning of the end of the carbon, the calculation for carbon cake. If we don't do any action, carbon cake finishes by 2035. Now, if you look at it, on 30th October, UN released this report where 146 countries have given their INDCs now. 146 countries. They account for 86% of the global emissions. So all the big ones have given their INDCs to the UN. Okay. Now we have a synthesis report. And if you look at what are the INDCs that countries have given, a lot of them want to do renewable energy, energy efficiency, transport. But one of the big things that countries are saying they are going to do is on forestry sector. In fact, forestry is going to be the biggest contributor to reducing emissions from now till 2030. But the fact is, and I think we should have the discussion, that we don't know how to measure emissions from forestry. One of the big area and big loophole in climate change is what is forestry's sink and what is forestry's emissions. That science is very, very poor. So we are relying on reducing emissions from a sector where science of measurement is very poor. Okay, that's a point.
So the bottom line of what CB is saying is that in all the INDCs, instead of focusing on reducing consumption or changing the way that people will actually use energy, what countries are hoping to do is to both invest in efficiency, which is energy efficiency, and to keep emitting but grow more trees so that you can soak up more emissions.
But there is also a politics. Please understand, the poorest live in forest areas across the world. So you are going to capture poorest people land and say, I am going to make it a dustbin for climate change. Okay? I am going to dump carbon dioxide. In India, for example, 100 million people lives in forest. Okay? 100 million people in India live in forest. And if suppose India decides that we want forests to sequester our carbon, we are going to take away their land and say, this is the plantation which is going to sequester carbon dioxide for the world. Okay? So I think the politics of forestry also needs to be understood very, very. So it's very nice when people say that we are going to grow a lot more trees and sequester carbon dioxide, the question needs to be asked, whose trees
land?
and whose land?
And what rights do they get over it, and what decisions do they get to make over the trees, and do they want to plant trees for sequestering carbon or for their livelihoods?
So, people are not talking about it, but we are doing a research at CSE, we are just beginning to do, looking at what is it that forestry is going to do in INDCs. I'll quickly go and say, I'm going to the conclusion because we don't have much time. The fact is, if we add all the INDCs, the emissions don't peak. It means that the world continues to increase emissions till 2030. Now, if you look at this chart, we keep increasing our emissions. The global emissions keep increasing. What happens is, the growth in emissions are reducing. So, we keep increasing. Maybe in business as usual, we will grow by 2%. Now, we will grow by 1%. Okay. But we keep increasing the emissions. So, the first thing that happens is, if you add all the INDCs till 2030, the global emissions doesn't peak. Okay. The second thing is that the emissions in 2030 will be at least 25% more than what it requires to be to remain within 2 degrees. So, there is a big gap, and you will hear this word all the time. Now, it used to be gigaton gap. The gap between what the world needs to do and what the world is doing. Now they are calling it as ambition gap. Okay. So, there is a change in word now. In Paris, people are talking about ambition gap. Okay. Now, so there is a 25% ambition gap till 2030. Okay. Number 3 is, we actually eat up 75% of our carbon budget by 2030. That's now. So, we will emit about 750 billion tons of carbon dioxide, the world as a whole, by 2030. So, only 250 billion ton is left after 2030, and there is absolutely, I am 100% sure, large part of Africa wouldn't have met their basic human development need even in 2030. Okay. Large part of India wouldn't have met its basic human development need even in 2030. We have about 300 million people in India who don't have electricity, 800 million people who cook on firewood. And I am sure in 2030, we will have at least 400 million people cooking on firewood. Okay. So, in 2030, when the carbon budget is over, almost over, there is hardly any carbon left for meeting the basic development need. And I want to make it very clear to all of you, people will say we can have a zero carbon economy. You know, we can have zero carbon electricity. We can also travel on zero carbon cars, but we don't know how to produce zero carbon food. Okay. I think it's very important for all of us to understand, unless until we start producing food in lab, we will need some amount of basic emission to meet our survival need. Food emissions, for example, we will need. We don't know how to produce clothes without carbon. How do you produce cotton without emitting agricultural emissions? Milk. We don't know how to produce cement and steel without emitting carbon dioxide. Okay. So, when things finish in 2030, when we would have not met our carbon, we would have not even met our basic development need, the carbon budget is over. Okay. So, and if this trajectory continues, and it's very interesting, when UN released this report, the Secretary General of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christina Figueres, said that we are on path. The temperature increase is only 2.7 degrees. That's what she said. We are on path. The temperature increase is only 2.7. She was lying on 2 fronts. Point number 1, 2.7 is bad, really bad. And second, it is not going to be 2.7. At the lower end, it is going to be at least 3 degrees. At the higher end, anywhere between 3.5 to 4 degrees. If this trajectory continues, we are looking at least 3 degrees temperature rise, not 2 degree and 2.7 that the UN is trying to sell it to every one of us. And if you look at the recent blog on these issues, a lot of scientists are outraged by this statement of the UN that the world temperature will only increase by 2.7 degrees. Okay, that's what I want to say. But what is important is, who is going to eat this carbon cake? If you add all the INDCs, you find that the developed world with about 10% of the global temperature will eat 26%.
10% of the global temperature.
Global population, the developed world with 10% of the global population will eat 26% of the carbon budget from now till 2030. So they continue to misappropriate carbon budget.
It's also important to understand that they've already eaten the carbon budget.
So they have misappropriated carbon budget in the past, and now their INDCs which they are submitting, EU will said they will reduce by 40%, US has said it will reduce by from 2005 level by 26-28% by 2025. If you add up those numbers, they will take about 260 to 270 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions from now till 2050. So they have taken about 26% of the carbon budget already. They are misappropriated unilaterally. And that is the beauty of INDCs. In INDCs, without declaring, you actually are laying claim to carbon budget. So the moment US said that I am going to reduce emissions by 25%, it is actually laying claim to the carbon budget, which people are not recognizing. It is in many ways a misappropriation by surreptitiousness. So they are saying I am reducing, but they are also laying claim to the carbon budget. This is what is going to happen. In 2012, the per capita emission of the US was 16.5, but in 2030 still remain 12 tons. So their so-called extreme reduction and the action they are taking will mean that in 2030, their per capita emission remains again at about 12 tons. You are right. China will become US in 2030. Okay? If China continues as it is doing right now, it will become US in 2030.
In fact, that's the deal.
Okay? And therefore, the US-China deal, all of you would have heard about a year back, was the deal on equity between US and China. Okay? So you are absolutely right. If we want US to reduce, we also don't want China to become 12 tons. That's not acceptable. Okay? That shouldn't be acceptable to any one of us, even if China is in developing countries and wants to claim to be in developing countries. This 12 ton of China will fry the world. But this 11 ton of US has already fried the world and will further fry it. Okay, so in both cases, it shouldn't be acceptable to all of us. If you look at EU, they will reduce, they will become 5. India will become about 3 tons in 2030. So,
But see, we go back, I want to show EU will go to 5 tons, which is important, and I think it's good to recognize it.
Yep.
But go back, CV, one slide. Go back one slide. Sorry, one slide. I want to show the pie diagram. But if you look at it, EU overall will have 17% of the global carbon budget between 1850 to 2000 and
about 15%, Sunita.
about 15%.
15%.
15%.
So from 1850 to 2030, US will have about 17%.
18%.
18%. EU will have 15%. So US and EU will account for 33% of the carbon budget.
And then if you add China to it,
China, you add 17, 50% gone. So EU, US and China will take care of 50% of the global carbon budget from 1850 to 2030. Okay, these three. And then the remaining will go to others. So 50% of the carbon budget is gone on China, US and EU. Okay. Now, so let me conclude quickly by saying that by any measurement, developed countries have fallen short of what they should be doing. In fact, by as much as 1/5. They are doing 1/5 of what they should be doing. Okay. And therefore, there is very little carbon space left because everyone is emitting. And therefore we need a mechanism at Paris. People don't want to talk about it. INDC's failures are now widely recognized. We need some sort of mechanism to revive the debate on distribution of carbon budget. If we don't do it in Paris, by 2030 there is nothing left for any one of us. Okay. So that debate has to start now in Paris.